Rok temu skończyła się atomowa wojna.
OBI-OBA. The ending confused me greatly. So what was with the hot air balloon and protagonists splitting in two, seemingly?
This is the nature of the film. I didn't make the film,
Okay.
so I can't possibly impose my view on that film, and I think it would rob it of its glorious ambiguity. What did you have any? Does anyone else have any interpretations of that ending which they'd like to share? Sorry to be evasive in this respect, but it does seem I'm the wrong person to say something about a deliberately ambiguous ending.
Okay, that's a fair answer.
Well, I'm just curious, what did you make of this last film? Because it is tonally very different from the other films, particularly in terms of its humour. I'm just curious to know what people made of it. Anyone have any feelings?
A lot funnier.
Yeah, I mean, it's yeah, it is funny, and it's got a happy ending, hasn't it?
Sure.
So the text said at the end.
What did you make of the hand?
The hand is one of the many things that confuse me about the movie.
It's kind of great though, isn't it? It's like the bit with the locker scene as well. It's interesting to look at the cast of the film because he does actually have a troupe of actors which are relatively consistent through the film, and it's kind of comforting to see some of the same faces, particularly when you see these two films tonight with Jerzy Stor playing two very different characters. They're sort of, on one level, they're kind of like part of the system, but in OBI-OBA, this is someone very weary, doubting whatever they're doing, whereas in Gaga, it's somebody who's very comfortable playing a rather grotesque role in the system. So yeah, it's quite wonderful. Yeah, Daniel Olbryski as well. You know, I'm sure you recognise this guy's face from countless Andrzej Wajda films and other Polish films at the time. But it's quite nice to see him playing this kind of anti-hero. Did you notice the credit for Pasolini's Ricotta in the opening credits? And I'm just wondering if anyone, how would you compare this film with Pasolini's Ricotta? Because it is interesting in terms of this was Shulkin's kind of frame of reference in the way that you have a double credit for a science fiction story and also a Pasolini story, which yeah, you kind of you have the three spikes, not crucifixes but spikes, and yeah, so there is this kind of religious element which of course it shares with the biblical arc in OBI-OBA. So yeah, it's interesting, this sort of religious science fiction kind of game he seems to be playing. And Shulkin, of course, was Polish Jewish of origin, but Poland, of course, being a deeply Catholic country, so it's very interesting to see this layers of on top of that.
I was wondering about the set in general in the second movie, because there's this scene in the stadium where there's this huge sign in German, and I was wondering if they built it for the movie as a reminder of German occupation, or if it was just there in the end in the 80s.
That's a very, very good point. In the 1950s, you had Stalinism in Poland is very, very kind of a focused period of time. It really kind of started obviously after the war in 47 through to about 56, and during that period of time you have a number of architectural features of Warsaw which are in the Stalinist style. The Palace of Culture being the most obvious one. There's a section in Muranov which is very much in the style of Karl Marx LA in East Germany, East Berlin. But in Gaga Glory to the Heroes there is the stadium, the Stadion, which is in that kind of like Stalinist Greco-Roman style, which fits perfectly for this kind of arena. So yeah, they used, it's an existing kind of building. That disappeared about 14 years ago, and it was replaced with a brand new stadium for the 2012 football. So there's a brand new stadium built on top of that kind of. But yeah, it looks exactly like that. This sort of Stalinist imitating a classical amphitheatre and arena. So of course they utilise that. I think it's a particularly interesting thing about these films, the way in which, because they don't have the resources and didn't have the resources to make these elaborate sets, of looking at pre-existing locations and then adapting them, and I think it works really well and fits the story in this case.
So the sign in German, because
Well,
it's not in Cyrillic, it's in German. So
Well,
it's a little
there's
confusing.
it's really interesting, the mixture of languages. When you think of all of the films, like the English in War of the Worlds,
Yeah.
the other, and then of course the mixture of languages in this one as well. I mean, it is a different planet. It's just this Australia. So you have this. I mean, these simple ways of saying it's not Poland, but is it Poland? You know who knows.
Well, it's always nighttime, so it might be Poland.
Well, I think the other thing about nighttime, I mean, it's there's I really love how he uses like all of these like lights to really just very lightly just break up the scene, and it gives it this kind of kitschy, otherworldly quality. I think this I really think that Gaga of the four films is probably the most underrated in terms of. I mean, it's very much kind of very broad in its humour, and it's very on the nose in many respects, but it does have a very strange ambience, the way in which the characters falling through all of these scenes, and I do think the lighting and this nighttime atmosphere really adds to that. It does feel like a sort of very dreamlike state.
Did he explain why it was supposed to be the nighttime the whole time? Because we never see the sun or daytime in the whole movie.
I'm not coming. I mean, there is an interview book in Polish, which it would be wonderful if it was translated into English. Okay. But I don't think he would volunteer that kind of information at the best of times. But I think, as any filmmaker, and Ridley Scott being the obvious example of if you want to create a certain otherworldly, futuristic ambience, shoot at night with lots of rain, and not obviously here, not rain, but lots of light. And I think it's a way of creating a consistent world, I guess. But that's just me speculating. As I said, I'm not Piotr Szulkin, unfortunately. So.
I was wondering, whenever I watch OBI-OBA, I'm always reminded of a different movie from the same time period by a Soviet filmmaker, Konstantin
Lukashansky.
Dead Man's Letters. I was wondering, did these two filmmakers know each other, know about each other, were they influenced by each other?
Well, Lukashansky was actually playing his films because I think what's interesting about Szulkin and Lukashansky is that their films were appearing in genre festivals abroad, and I think that this is an interesting question, how hiding behind the mask of genre, you could make very deeply personal films which did comment on a Soviet reality or a Polish reality, but you'd have this mask of a genre film, so it's not to be taken that seriously. So these films were appearing in genre film festivals. So I think and Szulkin was travelling. Szulkin met Sam Peckinpah, and apparently Sam Peckinpah liked his films. And I think it would be the case of Lukashansky too. I mean, the main reference, literary inspiration, is Arkady and Boris Strugatsky, and I think that they are a very, very strong parallel in terms of the way they approach allegory and genre to what Szulkin is doing. And I think that I don't think it's a direct kind of source, but at the same time, I think it's a very strong comparison between what these two filmmakers are doing. So yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a very apt comparison, and they are indeed contemporaries.
was the release of its movies in Poland, bro?
Well, the War of the Worlds, obviously this was delayed because of the whole issue of martial law, and then OBI-OBA was made immediately after martial law ended and premiered, I think, in January 1985, and then this film followed, quite soon after that. So of course, this period of time, the mid 1980s. It's a very specific moment because, of course, retrospectively, this is the moment when the Eastern Bloc sort of disintegrated and collapsed. So this is the time of Gorbachev and Perestroika and Glasnost. So I think these films were part of that public discourse of critically examining life and with an eye of possibly improving it. Of course, that wasn't the case. But the Gaga, I mean, it was distributed in Czechoslovakia, and so it was actually going abroad, and it did play at Genre Film Festival, so it did have an international play as well. I think the interesting question is how we have this standard narrative of Polish cinema, this new wave, and the Polish school, and then the stuff in the 70s. And I think we're only now trying to find a place for films like Szulkin, and I think this is what these programs are a great opportunity. How do they fit? Do they fit? Do they not fit into these narratives? Or do they fit in other narratives, like alongside Lubushansky, and or could you place them alongside films like Terry Gilliam's Brazil, because that's the same year as this, and I think you could draw strong parallels with Brazil in terms of the visual references, like kind of George Grosz and Otto Dix. There's kind of like Dada, kind of grotesque visions and things like that, and also this particular approach to science fiction and retrofuturism. So I think, it's kind of exciting when a film and a filmmaker's reputation is in flux, and it could be situated in other places, and I think that's part of the fun of these films, kind of returning at this particular moment in time. I know that's another evasive answer, but yeah.
Hi, I wasn't familiar with any of Szulkin's work before this week. I'm just wondering, was the happier ending here an outlier in the context of this tetralogy, or in general for his work?
I think it's fair to say, that this is a very pessimistic filmmaker, and a very pessimistic character, and I think if this does have a happy ending, it's always struck me as rather sarcastic. I don't know how it came across to you, but it's kind of like a fuck you, kind of ending. But yeah, I think a very pessimistic character, but one with a corresponding sense of humour. So but that's just, again, that's my interpretation. I don't know what Szulkin would say, but yeah. Well, I would take this opportunity to say that these are 4 concentrated, ostensibly genre films, but Szulkin made some very interesting films in different genres. He made some interesting documentaries. At the very beginning of his career, he made a film with Lindsay Anderson. Lindsay Anderson came to Poland to do a film which is known in English as The Singing Lesson. In Polish, it's Raz, dwa, trzy, 1, 2, 3. And that was with the cinematographer Zygmunt Samyszuk, who did both the Golem film and War of the Worlds. So yeah, he had this interesting collaboration of sorts with Lindsay Anderson right at the beginning of his career on a documentary. He made a very, very interesting short film in the 1970s, which is basically very clearly derived from Parajanov and The Colour of Pomegranates, with this sort of folkloristic tableaus. Given all this interest at the moment in folk horror, I'm surprised that that short film isn't kind of, placed in the context of those kind of programs. But it is very interesting that you have somebody talking very highly of Sergei Eisenstein as one of the biggest references, and really the pictorial, the graphic approach to filmmaking. This I think Shulkin, it's very important painting and conceiving film as a plastic lit composed thing. He did a film called Femina, which is really interesting as well. And his last film, when I moved to Poland, it appeared in the cinema and really didn't function with the audiences or the critics. It did play at genre festivals, I believe, in Brussels. It was a film adaptation of Jerry's King Ubu, with Katarzyna Figura, who plays the girl in Gaga. So I think it's an interesting film. It's yet to be appreciated, let's say, because it certainly wasn't appreciated when it came out. And unfortunately, it was Shulkin's last film, and then he spent most of the time afterwards teaching the Łódź Film School, where he was very much liked and well regarded. He did do some interesting TV theatre, and he personally regarded some of the TV theatre as his best work, which is interesting. I think this is a sort of gateway into appreciating the entire body of work of Shulkin, and who knows, maybe in a few years we'll be seeing complete Shulkin retrospectives in addition to the genre film titles he made.
How come he's so underrated? Is there a reason for it? Nobody
Well, I think because you have, in my opinion, it's only me speculating, but you have, either through critics or through promotion, you have narratives of what national cinemas are. It's the same. It's like in Czechoslovakia, and the idea that you have the idea of an archetypal Czech film, a comedy, and if a film doesn't quite fit that model, it's going to be put to the side, so you can kind of, and I think Shulkin, he just didn't fit in the way that Żuławski's films didn't fit, in the way in Poland Żuławski's films were considered, oh well, he's really French, and the way Borowczyk, he made just one feature film in Poland, and then his colleague, oh, he's really French. So you want to kind of create this narrative about what Polish cinema is, and Shulkin didn't fit that model.
But is it more known in other countries, or is it everywhere?
Well, I think what is interesting about this festival and this program is that I'm surprised the number of people like Dirk who was encountered Shulkin's films at genre film festivals and appreciated these films at genre film festivals. So he was certainly known in the context of genre cinema. But I think what I'm trying to say is that I think he is a major voice and an important figure it should be within the story of kind of a national, local Polish cinema. And I think it's partly down to the fact that how do you the kind of the story of kind of Andrzej Wajda, Agnieszka Holland, Kieślowski, Zanussi sort of dominating the story of Polish cinema during the 1970s, which is fine, but it omits a different type of cinema, a visual type of cinema, a cinema which we associate with Shulkin. I think these are more interesting visually. I think they're more sophisticated in terms of what they're trying to do with allegory and parable. But that's just my taste, and I think this is why these films sort of last in the way that there are many Polish films of the 1970s which are interesting historically in the way that they're about specific characters or events, and you can look at the films and discern something about history. But I think what's interesting about the Shulkin films is that because they have like a parable structure, they have resonance in other contexts and other times. And looking at these films, particularly reality TV or fake news, artificial intelligence. So I think that they sort of like speak today. They're not made specifically to address what's in the newspapers, but they do it in a general way. I think that's really why they're kind of interesting at this particular moment in time. I mean, I love the fact that, like, in this big stadium sequence, you see all the cameras, and it's more important to film this event than the event itself, which I think is very true of much of existence today, particularly in this age of social media, when being seen is more important than the thing in itself. And I think Shulkin's very good at capturing that, not just in Gaga, but also War of the Worlds, and this whole business of creating a myth, creating an illusion in OBI-OBA. So that's, I think, for me personally, I think these films have become more interesting, but that's simply in relationship to how the world has taken certain strange turns in terms of technology and politics. So that's why they speak to me.
Which, like you said, like the question about the comparison to Pasolini, I thought the last one with its absurd scenes reminded me a bit in some, well, he didn't make science fiction, but at the Brunel films, the absurdity of Brunel films.
I'm Shulkin. I'm sure. I mean, this is his genre. This is the kind of filmmakers he liked. I only mentioned Pasolini because he's got a specific credit at the beginning of the film, saying, acknowledging Ricotta, the short film. You know, there was that portmanteau film with different directors, and Pasolini did that with Orson Welles directing the crucifix, and the extra eats the ricotta and dies on the cross. And so the reason I mentioned that is that Shulkin is it's his riff on that idea. It's different, but it's his riff and it's his acknowledgement. But Buñuel, I mean, it's one of those dream directors for people like Shulkin. Poland didn't have an official surrealist movement like Czechoslovakia, but it does have, as an adjective, a very surreal aspect to much of its literature, much of its filmmaking, much of its theatre. You could say, Żuławski used to say, surrealism in Poland was sort of distended romanticism, and that's very much true of OBI-OBA, which has this very strong connection with romantic poetry, Cyprian Novid. So I think that's where that comes from, this sort of strange, romantic, dreamlike, surrealistic quality. But yeah, if you're a filmmaker like Shulkin, Buñuel is obviously one of your key reference points. Because it is like a very dreamlike film, isn't it?
Well, also with the religious stuff, Brunel does that also. I think he has also a thing with the crucifixion. Perhaps I mix Pasolini and Brunel.
No, I think that it's. I mean, Poland is a Catholic country. I mean, Shulkin was Jewish, but at the same time, you have this layers and layers, and I think that's the true face of Poland. It's the history of Poland. And I think that's the political battle of the previous government trying to, it's really Catholic and we just ignore all the Jewish heritage. But the flip side to that is that, Stanisław Lem is Jewish, Shulkin, Jewish, Bruno Schulz, Jewish. So you can't ignore this fantastic element. The Dybbuk, Jewish folklore. I remember going to Montreal with Żuławski, and it was Fantasia, so the genre film festival, and he actually said that all fantastic elements of Polish culture, it's rooted in Jewish folklore, and then he actually mentioned Shulkin as part of that tradition. And Kafka obviously is not Polish, but he's obviously part of that tradition too.
Funny also the reference to the one in the middle.
Yeah.
The cross in the middle. Who is going to be the one in the middle?
It's hilarious. The Vaseline and it's utterly grotesque.
We're waiting to if he's coming.
Yeah, that actually reminded me of Demolition Man. The 3 shells. The one in the middle. Yeah, that you're joking.
It's interesting. I mean, this film. I mean, I think you could. I think the obvious reference would be something like Dangerous Game in terms of, but also like The Running Man, the Schwarzenegger film of the televised gladiatorial combat. So it's interesting that this film would have been before that, but it's in the same ballpark, and so yeah, I think those are all valid comparisons. Demolition Man and The Running Man, and Pasolini. Well, thank you very much for actually watching these films. It's been a pleasure to see full houses for all 4 films. I think it's very encouraging to think that maybe that there's a chance for a full Shulkin retrospective sometime in the future. And thank you very much for putting up with me and tolerating my introductions and my flailing attempts to answer some of these questions or not. So, yeah.
One final question, not really related to the movies, but last time you mentioned the notion of a neon nightmares theme. Could you give that extra, perhaps?
That's not for me to say, but no, I think it's just like it's this 80s vibe in the way that, but it's also nice to go into Cinema Nova and see so much neon there as well. So obviously, and if you ever do go to Warsaw, there is a very nice neon museum there as well, because neon was a big thing in Poland during the 1980s, and fortunately, some people had the good sense to rescue a lot of these signs and collect them in a space. So if you are a fan of neon, head to the Neon Museum in Praga district of Warsaw. It's well worth your time.
I'll make a note of that.
Thank you very much.